Welcome to Proles of the Roundtable.
Hello and welcome to Proles of the Roundtable, where we sit down, have a few beers, and talk leftist history. Please do us a favor and subscribe on your favorite podcast app and rate or review to help extend our reach. Before we get started, we wanted to thank our sponsor, without whom we wouldn't have these nice microphones. So big thanks to our sponsor, the Washington Post.
Shout out to WAPO.
Yeah.
Comrade Bezos.
So anyway, today with us, we have Justin. Justin, what are you drinking?
Yeah, I'm Justin, and tonight I'm drinking Fremont Lush IPA, which is actually pretty tasty.
Nice.
I'm Taylor, and I've had a pretty busy birthday weekend, so I'm actually just drinking water. I'm super hungover.
Poor baby.
Yeah. Oops.
So we also have 8 Hop with us, who is he's going to be joining us in a moment. He is drinking 291 Distillery whiskey, which is pretty tasty stuff. I've had it myself. And then Alex, who is drinking Tommyknockers Blood Orange IPA. I'm Jeremy, and I am drinking Carta Blanca, which is a Mexican lager, and it's
Not great, Bob.
Nope, it's not great. There are definitely better ones. So I'm sure a lot of you are going to be excited, but tonight our guest is Ian Goodrum. What are you drinking, Ian?
Despite it being 9 a.m. here, I am in fact drinking. I've got here is Maotai, which is the Chinese national brand of baijiu liquor, which is like it's a sorghum-based liquor. It's kind of the national spirit of the country. People drink it at meetings and gatherings. But this one's a little special. It's the national brand because when the Communist Party of China was in the throes of the Chinese Civil War and in the Long March in the 1930s, they came through Maotai, which is a town in Guizhou, and they liked the liquor there so much that they drank it. Well, obviously they liked it so much that they drank it, but when the war was finished and in 49, when the Communist Party of China became the governing party of the country, they consolidated together a lot of the local baijiu brands into this national level brand, and so it's kind of the drink of choice for the government and the party still. So I'm fortunate enough to have a bottle, and I'm going to be taking not traditionally large shots, but like half a shot. That's the glasses that come with a baijiu bottle are smaller than your traditional shot glasses, so it won't be too ridiculous. But I will be periodically taking a shot to the dome.
So truly the people's liquor, right?
Yeah.
So before we get into the main topic, I guess, Ian, what I guess is your background? What gives you the voice, I suppose, of authority on this subject?
Sure. Yeah. I am currently working at China Daily, which is China's largest English language newspaper. I came here about a year and a half ago, so I wouldn't call myself, a long-term resident yet. I don't think a year and a half is very long, but I don't have any plans to leave in the long term either. So we'll see about the long-term residency, but that's my plan right now. I came here after jobs in the U.S. I worked at some local papers, some larger ones, some smaller ones, and I came to China. I'd wanted to come here anyway, but circumstances were such that it made sense to come here when I did. My previous job was in Iowa, and it was under a paper owned by Gannett. And if you know anything about Gannett, they love their layoffs. And they're still laying people off in the big bloodbath of earlier this year when 1,200 people, journalists, lost their jobs. Gannett was responsible for about 400 of those, so they haven't stopped. And it was suggested to me. I can't remember who suggested it, and I wish I could because I could give them credit. But they suggested that I look outside the country. and so it made sense. I was laid off with 300 other people looking for jobs at the same time. So going outside the borders of the U.S. made a lot of sense. And China was the first place I looked. China Daily was the first place I applied to, and they responded very quickly and were very helpful in the whole process of getting the paperwork done and getting things settled and arranged. And so I've been here working as an editor. I write columns as well. I do some video work when they ask me. And yeah, it's I came here for a lot of reasons. But the big one is that I wanted to kind of see the country for myself, learn more about the country's development. What the Communist Party does. I'm unapologetically a communist, so that's one reason why I came here. Which is refreshing because writing in the U.S., people talk about the censorship in China and the self censorship that journalists are claimed to have to do. But for me, it's been the opposite in that I had to self censor a whole lot more when I was in the U.S. and I can be a lot more open in my writing and in social media now that I'm here, and there's no kind of stigma. Job stigma attached to being a communist, and so for me, I felt a much greater degree of freedom, which tends to make people's eyes bug out and their heads explode if I tell them. But so that's been my experience so far. It's there are titles here. If you're working in China, if you get a work visa in China, no matter what you're doing, your title is foreign expert. And I actually don't think that's a fair title at all because I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself someone who's here to learn more than to teach or instruct or and if I do anything, I share information as opposed to kind of didactically instructing people or flouting my supposed expertise online and offline. So I mean that's what I see as my purpose here. I fully admit that with my politics, I am more sympathetic and inclined to agree with the government more than your average foreign correspondent. And there's reasons for that I'm sure we'll talk about in terms of how foreign correspondents operate in China and the kinds of broad ideological, political, social, economic structures that make the people that report in these places believe the things they do and act the way they do and all that. But for me, I see my I don't pretend at this kind of objectivity that I think a lot of liberal journalists do. People that claim to be non-ideological, but in fact uphold an ideology with the work they do and the things they support and the things they say. I don't make any secrets of that. You get what you see is what you get when it comes to me. And if you want to dismiss me on that basis, you surely can. But at least you know where I stand. So you should know where you stand when it comes to the stuff I share.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this several times before, but if you are apolitical or you feel like you're apolitical, you are actually siding with whatever the dominant ideology is wherever you are. So, here in the States, it's going to be, capitalist, quote unquote, democracy. But, elsewhere, it's going to be different things. So what topic more specifically would you like to discuss tonight?
Well, I mean, I thought we could talk about media coverage of China. You could say how it's changed, but I mean, really, the more compelling point to me is how much of it has stayed the same. How little of it has changed in the this year. It will be 70 years since the founding of the People's Republic of China, and how the narratives have not changed that much, despite the changes that have happened within the country and in the rest of the world. The kinds of responses you get from positive reporting and the kind of negativity you get is in many ways the same as you would get during the Civil War or during the PRC period. Take your pick of the year. It's all very similar. So that is I think the broad strokes of what we're going to be talking about.
Okay, cool. So what would you like to begin with?
Well, we can start, I guess, with the Civil War. This was a conflict between the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, and allied warlords. After the fall of the Qing Dynasty and the beginning of the era of the Republic of China, Shortly after that, the Communist Party of China was founded. It started out with the first National Congress of the Communist Party of China, I believe, had 13 people attend, 13 delegates, and the party as a whole had about 50 something people, I believe, at that time. So if you're losing hope that your organization or party is very small, don't despair. The Communist Party of China now has 89 million people, so things can change. Um, but this was a wide scale conflict that had its ebbs and flows. There were periods in which there was kind of a united front made against the Japanese, who were still the colonial imperial power, most notably during World War II. But for the majority of the time, it was the civil war between these two broad forces. And for a long time, from the 1920s to the 1930s, there was not a lot of information you could get about the Communist Party of China and its leaders. People didn't know who the leaders were, um, because the information that was coming out of China was basically all in support of the Kuomintang and Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist forces that were opposing the Communist Party. And of course, this was after the Bolshevik Revolution, so people were very wary of the idea of a communist revolutionary force. So you could say basically anything you wanted, and people would print it, and people would then read it and believe it. Um, this changed in the Long March era in particular. Finally, some foreign journalists were allowed into the revolutionary base areas of the CPC. The Long March, of course, being this strategic retreat across the country. This kind of really devastating campaign that turned the Red Army, the first Red Army that had about, I think, 70,000 people, into a force of about 7,000. So we had a total decimation of the forces. Literally 1 in 10 didn't make it to the end of the march. And the reason we know about it, and the reason people knew about it then, is because journalists were there finally. And these journalists were, to varying degrees, sympathetic to communist causes, to labor causes, to socialist causes. And so they were trusted, and they were let in, and so they were able to actually give a window into this fighting force, and how they organized, and how they governed, and what they did in the base areas. They were kind of setting up these almost dual power structures that were happening, for the poor peasants in these areas, and setting up these organs of assistance and aiding development, that got the peasantry on the side of the Red Army and the Communist Party. And so, what's interesting is that these people like Edgar Snow, people like Agnes Smedley, Anna Louise Strong, Israel Epstein, Norma Bethune came over as a doctor. George Hatem came over as a doctor, but these were important figures because these were like the emissaries between the CPC and the outside world, right? So these were trusted people, who were let in and given this kind of trust to share the story with the world. And Edgar Snow is probably the most prominent of these. And I mean, it's entirely possible because the Communist Party USA, especially at the time, there were people who were members that didn't, trumpet it. They kept it pretty secret, close to the vest. So I mean, it's possible that some of these people had memberships in parties, but as far as what we can actually prove, it depends. I mean, some people were, like Anna Louise Strong, was very militantly pro-labor and an activist, and made no secret of that. She did work in the Soviet Union as well as China. But Edgar Snow, I think, is a good example of how people are treated, when they report positively or even just sympathetically about a burgeoning communist movement. It didn't matter whether he was a card carrying communist or not. I don't think he was, but even if he were, it didn't matter because when his reporting came through, and it was, it sold pretty well. It sold well outside of the U.S. and the West too. People tarred him with that brush anyway. They branded him, a traitor, a communist, whatever epithet you want to use, and so he had struggles when he came back to the U.S. I believe there was a period in which he couldn't leave, for a while. So, and I think the same thing happened to people like Agnes Smedley and Anna Louise Strong. They basically decided, well, if my home country doesn't want me, then I'm just going to leave. And so they ended up staying in the Soviet Union or China. Many of them are buried here. because they just decided to live here because it wasn't worth trying to fight the kinds of restrictions and repressions they were getting from their home governments. Those bastions of free speech and free press.
Right.
And so yeah, I think to varying degrees people were members or sympathetic with communist parties and movements, but the real takeaway is that it didn't matter whether they were totally impartial or not, because they said nice things about the dirty Reds, and so when they got back, it didn't matter what they said or how they kind of justified it, because their governments and the people the people that read the stuff being published about them, just took it as an article of faith that these people were subversive agents uh, uh, of a foreign power ready to subvert and destroy American democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So even the only real relief you got from this was in the Second World War, whenever China was an ally against Japan, and the Communist Party wasn't waging war against the Kuomintang. Same with the Soviet Union, right? These were the periods when the Reds were on our side, and so you actually had a space in which you could say positive things, and by the sheer force of geopolitics, the repression was less severe. Right, you had more free reign. Not coincidentally, this was when I think the communist movement in the U.S. especially was at its height, and I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think there's a reason for that, and it's because the state backed off for once. So yeah, you've got this phenomenon of people reporting back and people reading it and people being interested for a number of reasons. Some people were supportive of the ideological project of the Communist Party. Some people thought that this was Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai and Zhu De were just good nationalists, good anti-Japanese nationalists, and we could consider their support in terms of preparation for what was looking to be an inevitable World War II with Japan and Germany allied. So to me, this is like Red Star over China is the kind of baseline foundational work for this kind of reporting that people were getting, because it was the most widely read. It was translated into the most languages. It had a huge impact. It's basically the 10 days that shook the world for China and the Chinese Revolution. There's an interesting story in one of the introductions that Snow gives to his revised version about how he was talking to, I can't remember the specific place. It might have been the Soviet Union, might have been somewhere else. I think it was a place where there was still like a burgeoning revolution happening, and a woman spoke to him, not knowing who he was, and asked if he'd read this book, Red Star Over China, which detailed some of the tactics and strategy of the Red Army in China, and they then used to kind of support their own struggle. And he didn't say whether he said I actually wrote that or if he just left it alone, but it was a very
Yeah.
good anecdote for how important it was. I've had personal experience with this too. Last year I went on a trip up and down the Yangtze River for just studying this economic belt area and the development that's been happening in the last few decades. And one of the places we went to was the site of the Zunyi Conference, which, if you don't know what the Zunyi Conference is, this was a meeting of during the Long March. This is a meeting of the leadership of the Red Army and the Communist Party, and this was the point at which Mao Zedong started his path to become the leader of the party and the army. And it also was the point at which the tide started to turn, and the march was still going on, but it was a moment of great galvanization and resurgence of revolutionary fervor, and so consequently the government has been building these what are called red tourism sites. They're kind of reclaiming the legacy of the party and building up kind of important landmarks and places, and making them tourism spots, building big museums. So I actually went to the site, and there's the original site there, very small building, restored, kept up. But then the museum is roughly 5 times that size, off in the distance. And when I was there, I was there with other journalists from Chinese media. But the really touching thing was that after we had our early meeting, and we went to the museum, the public came in. And it was absolutely packed, right? There's thousands and thousands of people in this historical site. you couldn't get a picture of some of the stuff anymore because of the crowds around it. And so for me, it was very heartening to see this kind of you know the sense of history isn't lost,
Sure.
right? The sense of history explicitly tied to the revolutionary struggle and the Communist Party. But relating that back to foreign reporting, I actually talked to one of the assistant curators of the museum, and when he found out I was an American, and when he found out I was an American communist, one of the first things he asked about was Edgar Snow. This is a guy who obviously wasn't alive during the revolutionary period. He was born after the PRC was founded, but he knew that
Right.
name because it was so important to getting the message out and telling the real story about what was happening in China at the time. That gave that it certainly, I think, probably gave some cover to people who might have wanted to intervene on behalf of the Kuomintang at the time. But it was it was an important kind of inspirational text, right? This was proof that people in the West were not all condemning the communists. There were people who cared. There were people that wanted to share this story because they believed in the mission, and so that became a source of strength. And it was so important then that there's a guy talking to me about it now. We talked about Edgar Snow's library. He said if he ever went to the U.S., he'd want to go, and he asked me where it was, and I told him Kansas City, where Edgar Snow is from, and it was a nice conversation. And half of Edgar Snow's ashes are on the campus of Peking University. The other half are back in Kansas City. But then there's the Babaoshan Revolutionary Cemetery, where there's Anna Louise Strong, Israel Epstein, George Hatem, all these journalists and figures that were supportive of the Communist Party, who made the trip in the early years, who are honored with a place beside Chinese revolutionary leaders, Chinese government
Yeah.
figures. There's former general secretaries and premiers buried there at the like Juda is buried there, one of the most important generals of the Red Army. Like it's a real sense of honor and tribute that you get when it comes to how China treated its friends, right? These people that proved their that proved their commitment to the revolutionary struggle. And that that particular experience at that museum was very touching for me. It was like, okay, this isn't dead, this kind of idea, but at the same time, right, these were people who, again, maybe they wanted to go home, maybe they wanted to get back to their homelands and do whatever work they wanted to do, but because of the way they were treated, they said, okay, well, I'm going back to where I am respected and where I'm
Sure.
wanted, right? Like where my work has value. And so a lot of them ended up living out the rest of their lives in these socialist countries, these countries that had successful revolutionary movements.
So I like in tying this back into sort of modern Western journalism. Every time that it's sort of refreshing to hear you speak positively about the quote unquote red tourism, because every time I read an article from the New York Times or the Washington Post about them, it's always sort of this tongue in cheek, like, they're capitalizing on their legacy of communism. They're making a theme park out
Yeah.
of the communist movement. So
Yeah, there's that theme park in Wuhan that I haven't actually been to yet, but I plan to go at some
I
point.
mean, it looks fun. So I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it's very cynical. These kinds of reports, right? There's this generally agreed upon, and now we're getting into the more modern reporting. There's this generally agreed upon principle that, well, the principle is that the Chinese can't be trusted. Basically, that's what it boils down to. But what they say is that if there's like a genuine push toward upholding the revolutionary legacy, treating history with respect, valorizing the leaders of the revolutionary struggle, because of China's perception among many as this kind of revisionist capitalist nation. Um, there's a very smug tone about it, like, oh, these foolish people are trying to they're trying to link what they're doing now back to the past, and how silly for anyone to honestly believe people think sincerely about this, and oh, what a joke these places are. Well, for one thing, these red tourism sites are almost uniformly free, so good job capitalizing on that. Building giant museums that cost millions and millions, if not more, and then not charging
Right.
admission. and continuing to subsidize their
Right.
operation. But yeah, it's this idea that there's no commitment anymore, and if there's this assumption, a very cynical assumption on the part of uh, Western journalists of cynicism on the part of the Communist Party of China and the
Sure.
government, right? Like they believe China is as cynical as them, and that there is no genuinely authentic revolutionary spirit or belief in the past or anything. It's all just kind of this 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 realpolitik kind of way of triangulating and keeping the people's support by reminding them of the past.
It's a projection.
Yeah. I mean, you get this in story, any kind of positive story about something that's unambiguously a good thing in China, like poverty alleviation or low unemployment. This idea that China maintains, low, almost non-existent extreme poverty rates now, or that it maintains an almost full employment economy because they want to placate the people and keep them satisfied, right? Like it can't just be because you want to keep people employed. It can't just be because you want people to not be poor anymore.
Tells you more about the West than it does the East.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea that there's a genuine desire to better the lives of the majority of the people in a country, and that country still refers to itself as socialist is just insane, right? People think, especially after 1991, right? People are just like, "Oh, we won." That's the end of history. There's no reason to discuss it anymore. We won. The end. Everybody believes what we believe, and so that's the end of everything. And this is reflected. This is reflected not just in the broader ideology, but in the personal beliefs of the people that are doing this reporting. Right. There, in newspapers and magazines and online outlets and think tanks and NGOs. These people are all true blue believers, right? Like they believe, like it's an honest, well, not an honest, because there's a great degree of dishonesty in terms of where these places get their funding and their support, but in terms of like they're very nakedly cynical, and they want to project it on everybody else, and this is stuff we saw. These same arguments were leveled against the Soviet Union, against Cuba, against DPRK.
Something that the right shares with most of the left.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, well, in fairness, I mean, look, if you had the kind of system that the U.S. had, and you were seeing politics happen all the time, and it was like this horrible, death march into the abyss, right, where nobody really can be supported with any sincerity because everybody compromises, everybody capitulates, everybody is subject to the whims of capital, right? Then I kind of get it.
Sure.
Like I kind of get why you would think, well, nobody is sincere and nobody really believes in anything because this is the political reality you're living under, right? So that too, that does make some sense.
So they actually are well received with Edgar Snow's Red Star over China, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there's a readership that exists outside of kind of the think tank industrial complex, the academic industrial complex. There's readership of regular people who are interested. But I mean, the U.S. government read it too, right? They were curious. They had about as much information about the communists as anybody else, right? They were getting the same stuff from the Kuomintang. So it was read by a lot of people, but the reactions varied. Part of why it was successful is that the way that Snow wrote was, I guess, I mean, he was sympathetic, but he wasn't. I don't think he was as ideological as others were. So
Yeah,
whenever
yeah.
he talked about the CPC and the work they were doing, there's a reason why some people thought of them as nationalist fighters or agrarian reformers, right? Because again, there's a cynicism of like, well, they can't really believe in communism, right? Like this kind of sentiment coming up, even back then, even during the early period of communist socialist revolutions.
Yeah, it's like almost like no conception of an actual genuine acceptance of it.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is an attitude that's held, to today. There's no genuine belief. There's no trust in the Chinese government as being one that means what it says and does what it means and says. Like I made the joke one time that the Chinese government puts out this huge, thick 5-year plan every, of course, 5 years about what they want to do, the goals they want to achieve, how they want to achieve them, et cetera, et cetera. But then you get every commentator Like every couple months, there'll be something in Bloomberg or Foreign Policy or something like, we don't really understand China. Like it's like, well, you could read the report that they give you where it says, here's what we want to do, but they can't take that at face value, or it's not even face value. They can't even accept that as like a genuine statement of purpose.
Yeah.
It's like what's the secret here? Like they go in like trying to figure out the real meaning behind the words, and it's all very it all goes back to
Racist?
again. Yeah, of course. Well, that's what I was saying. It goes back to this idea of
Yeah.
it goes back to this idea of the Chinese can't be trusted, which is a fundamentally racist kind of assumption to make, especially with regard to a country in Asia. So yeah,
And there's a lot of discussion about the denial of their revolution because they are non-European. That's definitely a big topic for conversation. And I just find it super interesting that it was received so differently because, I mean, of course, like a lot of people, I read Red Star Over China, and I was like, I have no clue how this was received because, in the US, obviously we have a very filtered and biased view of it. So that's super
yeah.
interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was uniformly positive, but it was treated as a subject of interest. That text especially, and yeah, I mean, the skepticism continues through today, as we talked about. It's the reporting itself is very cynical. I think the best example probably of how things haven't really changed that much is in terms of so the China shorthand now is people talk about Foxconn. That's the one thing they know about China, or they talk about social credit. Right, these are the two big things people are aware of. I guess pollution, but pollution isn't as much of a problem now. I actually got here in 2017, and the winter in Beijing was pretty good. Like there were a couple of rough days, but nothing like what it used to be from what people tell me. So they can't rely on that anymore. They can't rely on like the picture of the sunrise in the smoggy skies that people say, oh, the Chinese government has to show people the sunrise on a screen because people don't see it in the real world anymore. When that was just an advertisement, right? Like it came out that was an advertisement. Nobody ran that story, but they ran I mean, this is the strategy, right? You publish something about China, and this applies to DPRK, Venezuela, Cuba, anywhere. Cuba had the bogus story about the sonic attacks melting diplomats' brains, right?
Right.
And it turned out it was just crickets.
Right.
I don't really think you need to use a weapon to melt American diplomats' brains.
Yikes.
But this is the thing, right? You can report whatever you want basically because the vetting that should take place as standard journalistic practice either doesn't happen because nobody cares because people will read whatever you print about China, or it doesn't happen because people people's biases affect you don't do the vetting because you're conditioned to think a certain way about China or another country, and so you just say, well, this must be true. And I think there's no better example of this than the supposed social credit system, right?
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
You got these stories in the Western press, big outlets, right? And everybody's favorite analogy, everybody's favorite symbolism was Black Mirror, right? Everybody talked about Black Mirror. China's doing Black Mirror. Black Mirror is happening in China, et cetera, et cetera. Terror and fear. And what they did was they conflated kind of local programs. So this idea of social credit is that there's this score that's assigned to you based on various factors, and this determines whether you can do certain things. That there's this big number that the government keeps in a file somewhere, and that's that's your number, and that's you, and that's your value to the state. Well, the reality is there is no such score. But some places and some companies, what they do is they conflate local governments and private companies because there's Ant Financial does a credit system that gives you like a traditional credit score, and the only outcome is that you might get discounts on some things. You don't pay more if you have low credit.
Sure.
You just pay less if you have good credit. But they take these disparate systems that don't have any connection to one another, and they say this is a huge national trend. The central government is putting a number on people's faces, and it betrays these are supposed experts, people that live in the country or supposed to have some kind of advanced knowledge, but if you know anything about the way governance in China works, the way it happens is if a local government will have there's a period of comment on a draft law that happens at a local level and on a national level, but even after that comment period, the governments will put out the law, and it's basically a gauge of public opinion, right? They'll make the proposal or they'll make the announcement, and if people go nuts and say what the hell are you doing, they'll be like, just kidding, gotcha, and so they will amend or not implement the law. There's a good example of this, a positive example of this in terms of the government's autonomy compared to this image we get of a centralized dictatorial state. There was a local province. I can't remember whether it was Fujian or Hunan or anyway. They proposed paid leave for only children. And if you know, China for a long time had a one-child policy where unless you were a member of a ethnic minority group or lived in a rural area, you could have one child. It was generally to keep the population from exploding. But so there's a lot of only children in China, and so there was this scheme proposed for paid leave for only children to take care of their parents if the parents are ailing or sick or out of town. You would get paid time off of work to do whatever you had to do to take care of that whatever was happening. And this is a positive example because people, of course, loved it. It's a good policy. So now it's being adopted, and I just edited a story the other day. 10 more provinces are picking it up, and each province has its own rules. Some provinces have a disciplinary system for employers, where if you don't give them the leave, they get hefty fines. Some places don't have that. This is the way policymaking in China works to a great degree, right? The central government will hand down kind of broad goals or directives, and the local governments will get a pretty good amount of latitude in terms of interpreting it and enacting it. So you get, bringing this back to social credit, some places are doing like very small fines for jaywalking. Some places are doing stuff with facial recognition. But the only government policy as far as social credit is concerned is about things like not paying fines, not paying debts, and like in terms of air travel restrictions, like not doing terrorism. and I guess the biggest one that got the most attention was smoking on trains, right? Because the high-speed trains are a non-smoking space, and so if you violate it, then there is a punishment levied. But the interesting thing is the thing that people don't talk about as much is the actual set of punishments that are laid out by the actual central directive from the state council, which is like the cabinet of China almost. The punishments are as follows. You can't ride high-speed trains. Well, you can ride some high-speed trains. The high-speed trains you can't ride are the top-tier ones, the ones that go about 50 kilometers per hour faster and have luxury tiers of seating. So like the very fancy trains. You can't send your kids to expensive private schools. You can't engage in conspicuous luxury consumption.
I'm sensing a theme here, Ian.
Yeah, it's strange. It's almost like it's designed to punish the wealthy and not the regular people.
That is very strange.
Yeah. And so the punishments are meted out by this credit list that you're on, and basically if you pay your fine or your debt or whatever, then you get off the list. And then as far as like violations on the train or on air travel, for the train, if you violate one of these things, like smoking especially, you pay a fine that's equivalent to the price of your ticket. If you get on the train without a ticket, you pay a fine that's equivalent to the price of your ticket. So it's very, we're talking about a few hundred yuan at best. The biggest one is that air travel is restricted completely. But I think the reason for this isn't talked about so much. For me, what it seems like is if you look at the rest of the punishments that are clearly designed to punish wealthy people, then total restriction on air travel is a way to keep white collar criminals and debtors, wealthy debtors who took out maybe like a big loan from the government and didn't pay it back, or they have a big fine levied on them. The social credit system also applies to businesses. I think a lot businesses and enterprises and government entities more than individual people. But it's the individual aspect that's gotten a lot of discussion because that's relatable and scary and so on and so forth. So if you're a white collar criminal being targeted by this social credit punishment, what's the first thing you're going to want to do, right? You're going to want to leave the country and flee, so you don't have to pay. Well, a good way to keep that from happening is to say, nope, no air travel for you, and keep them grounded. But these aspects aren't reported on that much, and it took it took months and months and months for foreign policy to put out an article saying, here's what the social credit system actually is. Now, they still did some of the scaremongering that everybody does when they write a story about China. There's also this tendency, you see this a lot. I think the worst offender is a woman named Anna Fifield. She used to be the Washington Post person in Pyongyang DPRK, and she got moved.
Sponsor of the episode.
Yeah, yeah. Shouts out to to our comrade Bezos. But yeah, like she got reassigned from DPRK to China, so it's basically like, okay, you're still on the anti-communism beat, basically. But she'll especially do this thing where if she says anything positive about DPRK or China or whatever, she'll always, like, as a parenthetical or as an addition, will be like, now remember, this is a privilege afforded only to the very wealthy.
Oh,
like
Lord.
if she talks about how,
Right.
if she talks about like a nice Pyongyang metro station, she's like, only the party faithful get a spot
Oh, man.
Of course.
in Pyongyang, and so there's this need to
Yeah,
qualify.
I mean, that's like we read that article. I think it was from the New York Times that was talking about the quote unquote black markets in the DPRK, which weren't even black markets because they said they opened as black markets during the famines in the 90s, but were eventually sort of quasi-legalized. They began to be taxed. They began to be regulated. So they're not black markets. They're at best gray markets.
Yeah.
But then they're like,
Yeah.
they offer things like solar panels, which are only available to the most wealthy in the DPRK, as though there's this like massive upper class,
Stratification.
which sits, beyond the level of the working class people in the DPRK. But I mean that's always how
they're
it
just
is.
they're sitting on a mountain of solar panels, just laughing to themselves.
Sure, yeah.
And if you're like one of 140 million folks, I would trust my credit more with the CPC than with Experian,
Yes.
or Equifax.
Yeah.
Who got
Sure,
hacked.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that equivalency is not brought up so much. The fact that there is a number on people in
Yes.
the U.S.
And it
whereas
tells me
there's
what
not
homes
in
I can buy,
China,
what
but-
cars I can buy, what phones I can get, what.
Or what you can't do.
Well,
what
and
you
it's
can't buy.
also built off of a lot of metrics that aren't necessarily valid in any
Yeah.
measurable sense. Like when I broke my leg last year, AMR is a for-profit enterprise
ambulance company,
that runs ambulances. I didn't pay, or my insurance, they had the wrong insurance. They didn't pay within like 2 weeks. I was sent to collections immediately. And while I was working through my insurance to get that paid for, that can tank your credit score. Like
Sure.
you can get it paid back through insurance or whatever, but it still tanks it, and you have to rebuild that.
And if you do like the American responsible thing of, not accumulating debt, i.e. not getting a credit card, well, guess what? You can't do shit
Right.
because you have to actually
Yeah.
create debt in order to
you have to
live in
build
the US.
credit, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I think that is
Yeah.
really, really showing of how we try to pretend that we don't have these systems, but really we have fucked up systems. We just
Personal
don't.
choices.
Yeah, we just don't put names to
Right.
them like we try to label other countries. So
Well, I mean, the credit stuff is really it is a if you it's essentially a compliance mechanism to participate in the system of capitalism, right?
Yeah.
Like it's this is what you have to do in order to be a good capitalist citizen, right? But we don't. But people don't think about that in ideological terms. They think it's just a fact of life because they grew up with it, and it's just kind of around them all the time.
it's really, really it's internalized, really.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, you contrast that with a system in China where the reality is very different from what's being presented, but again, because the major media is all in lockstep against these countries, which coincidentally are targets of U.S. empire and imperialism, I'm sure that's just accidentally worked out in everybody's favor, and that the bad guys all happen to be the people the U.S. doesn't like.
Of course. Regimes, you mean? Regimes.
Yeah, yeah. Of course. But I mean, the misrepresentations, if they ever get a correction, which they rarely do, I mean, we know about this with the DPRK as well, right?
Yes.
If we believed everything we read about the DPRK, we'd believe they're capable of necromancy.
Right. I mean, the fucking haircut thing, like
Yeah,
that was
yeah.
proven to be like falsehood almost immediately, and there were no retractions printed.
Right, and if there is a detail that would kind of sap the power of the headline, it's buried in like the
Yes.
eighth paragraph,
For sure.
right? It's
Yeah.
it's because people mostly only read the first paragraph, if even that. Most people just read headlines. So you can, the headline is the most important, and even if you include information later on that kind of throws water on the premise of the headline, then it doesn't matter because people aren't reading it.
Right.
The damage is already done. So even if foreign policy puts out an article later, very nuanced article about how no, actually there isn't this credit system that you think exists, and it's good for foreign policy, but foreign policy is still a huge kind of promoter of U.S. They just put out an article about how Britain should retake the seas and reclaim the glory of the old
Jesus.
British Navy,
What?
they named Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia one of their global thinkers for the year. So I mean, it's
Amazing.
the biases are very obvious there, but yeah, so you put out that article, but months after the big push has already happened, and every major outlet has put out something about this Black Mirror-esque social credit system. So it doesn't matter. It's in the language now. If you read comments online, if you talk to people, when I was back in the U.S. for a few weeks last December and January, one of the things I got asked more than anything else was like, "How's that social credit system?" And I have to be like,
Yeah.
"It's not actually real. It's not actually real."
Yeah.
And they're very surprised by this, and I have to, it takes a lot longer to explain the reality of the situation than it does to write a headline with the words Black Mirror in it,
Yeah.
right? Like correcting the record on this stuff takes detail, it takes work, it takes effort, research, it takes, framing, the argument in a way will be the most kind of impactful and convincing, which is what every writer does, even if they're claimed to be an objective journalist. You write headlines and you write lead paragraphs to keep people interested, so it's something everybody does. And it takes a lot more work, right? And the people that might debunk these ideas, I mean, even foreign policy is not a huge, massive media outlet. It's a niche media outlet with very powerful people reading it.
Right.
But the mass media is again in lockstep behind these narratives, and so with our limited platforms, we can only do so much, but we still have to.
Sure.
But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to correct people's ideas, and even if you break through and you make a good argument, they're going to go back out in the world. They're going to go back out to they're going to keep reading the media that says this stuff, and whether you mean to or not, you're going to internalize some of that.
Yeah.
So it's the most uphill of uphill battles, but we still have to do it.
And we're talking about the social credit score thing, which has some basis in reality, but often stories about the DPRK or China, you click back on the, source, back to another source, back to another source, and it leads to like, Radio Free Asia, which is, if people don't know, is a CIA like funded.
Yeah.
Like,
well, no, it's government radio explicitly founded as an anti-communist project in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in Cuba, in South America.
Yeah.
And this is another thing, right? This and full disclosure, right? I work for China Daily. China Daily is a state-owned media outlet. I operate under the,
Wink for the
we operate
camera,
under the yeah. We operate under the State Council Information Office. That's a government office. So this is the reality. I don't make any secret of it. There's people there's people who will occasionally, like if there's a post on Twitter or somewhere, be like quote tweeting me and be like, "Hey, just so everybody knows, this guy works for the Chinese government." And it's like, okay, well, you can Google my name and it's everywhere, so it's not some big like I don't know what they want me to. They I guess they want me to put a disclaimer under every single post I make, like, oh, by the way, this is where I work.
Like
but
Facebook was doing to all those South American news outlets back a few years ago.
Yeah, but you notice that Radio Free Asia and the like don't get the same kind of treatment, right? They're taken as a given. The expert bubble in DC especially takes RFA and Radio Free Europe as gospel.
Well, I mean, even like the BBC, like there's no big disclaimer when on any BBC like anything that's like, oh, just by the way, this is paid for by the British government.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, YouTube now puts little caution symbols underneath videos by state broadcasters, but they'll say, like, but there's a difference in how they frame it. Like they'll say BBC is a public company or public media outlet, and they'll say China Daily or People's Daily or RT is funded by the Chinese government or funded by the Russian government. So it's like very deliberate language. But the other thing,
they did the same thing with Telesur, or not Telesur. It was with
well, they did do it to Telesur.
Al Jazeera.
Yeah, they did.
No. No, it may have been Telesur where they said funded by the South American
Oh
government.
yeah, I remember
which
that.
is
the Latin American government,
That's not a
that
thing.
that
that doesn't
unified body.
exist. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, talk about Orientalism, but
Sure, yeah. And this is the other thing, right? So there isn't this kind of standard applied to corporate media or U.S. government media that is applied to the state media of enemy states or targeted states. And this is the thing, right? It's a huge ecosystem because even if you put aside the reporting, right? If you a lot of the sourcing that isn't from straight up, like in the case of the DPRK, like just ROK spy agencies. But even if you put that aside, right, there's a formula to how the actual, like, the granular reporting takes place, even in a major media outlet. And now and when you know the formula, you'll see it everywhere because you can't stop seeing it because it's all over the place. What'll happen is if there's reports happening on an event of some kind, what the usual foreign correspondent strategy is, they'll go to an event. So, for example, this is something that I've seen personally, so I can attest to the differences in experience. But I'm going to name names because I don't really care about offending these guys. There's a guy named
Go
Tom
off, King.
Phillips. Yeah, there's a guy named Tom Phillips who works at The Guardian. He used to be the China bureau chief. Now he's the bureau chief in Mexico, and now, of course, he is the point man for Venezuela.
of course.
What a coincidence! Like, this is the other thing that I can talk about in a minute, but the framework of the reporting is, so, for example, he went to one of these poverty alleviation villages in China. Now, what these are part of the big poverty eradication campaign. The push to get rid of extreme poverty by 2021. They're very close. The poverty rate is down to, I think, 1.5%. Compare that
Jesus.
to the U.S., which is compare that to the U.S., where the poverty rate has not dropped below 11 since the 1970s.
Sure.
But anyway, these are like villages, towns built by the government or by a contract, given out by the government. Because a lot of the rural population in China, the ones way out there, they live in, like, mountainous areas. Like, they've been living there for generations. So they're very separated. They're very disparate in the area. There's not a sense of community, and public services are very poor in those places because getting electricity out to these very, very remote areas and distributing them to these scattered communities is very difficult. Same with water, same with fiber optic cable for internet. So one of the things that's being done by local governments is they're building these villages, like new buildings with electricity, running water, what have you. Not individual internet yet. There's internet centers now. It's a gradual process. So, I mean, I think this is another thing. Huawei is getting propagandized against very heavily right now because they're, for a number of reasons, but especially because they're trying to build 5G infrastructure in China and the rest of the world.
Damn.
Now, what's not emphasized as much about this is that 5G means that instead of laying fiber optic cable across the entire world to get people high-speed broadband level internet, you just have wireless towers, right? So this is an easier way to get the very fast internet out to as many people as possible. So this is a solution to the problem of internet access for the remote parts of China, and this is a heavily subsidized by the government. It's almost like the government wants to maximize benefit for all people instead of maximizing profit.
That's weird.
It's
really weird.
But anyway, so these villages are like these new buildings, centralized, like a more centralized location, closer to employment, closer to these resources, and with reliable, stable public services. And so people move in from these places, and they have they have homes of their own and everything. Well, I pick on the Guardian specifically because I think this guy was the worst offender. So he went there. And what he did was he clearly talked to some of the people there, almost certainly through a translator. Here's another tip: if you see the author's byline for a story about China or Venezuela or somewhere else, the big byline, and then with reporting from somebody with a Chinese name or a Spanish name, or at the very bottom, like assistance provided by, guess what? That's the person who did most of the work.
Yeah.
They did the translating. They did the hard actual reporting because the people that are there are mostly dilettantes who don't speak the language. But this guy specifically, so he talked to some people, right? But he came in with a very specific idea of what he wanted to talk about, because you can tell in the story, it was all about kind of how this poverty alleviation village was a means of ensuring support for the government and for Xi Jinping, the president of China, the general secretary of the Communist Party. So, and this is the tone of most of the reporting, that this is a dictatorship, that this is a one-man rule, that the cult of personality reigns supreme, so on and so forth. So this guy talked to a couple people, but here's the thing. If you see the quotes that are being used, you know the questions that are being asked. So the quotes he got from one of the villagers was about, like, specifically about Xi Jinping, because he saw a portrait up of Xi in one of these buildings. And so, you don't get that kind of response if you don't just come up and ask, what do you think of Xi Jinping, right? What do you think of the president of China in relation to this? So, you're giving the game away very, very obviously there. Imagining myself in that situation, when I went to the village, here's the questions I had. I couldn't care less about a portrait. What I care about is, how is your life different now that you have this place to live in? What is it like having stable public services? What are you doing as far as employment? What are you doing as far as income? Like, how is your income improved? These very important material benefits that these people should be enjoying, right? What I want to know is, it's nice to build a village, but has it actually helped people?
Sure.
So those are the questions I would ask. I wouldn't give a shit about whether there was a portrait of Xi or Mao or Donald Trump, for that matter, in one of these villages, because the material gains are what's important. But this guy clearly asked them about the portrait. Like, he clearly asked them about the portrait and about Xi. He made like a wry comment about how some people didn't know who Xi was, which kind of disproves his point of a cult of personality, unlike this dictatorship, right? If it's all encompassing, people should know who that guy is, right? So like, you could tell. So these are the questions he asked the people that were actually there. Like, the actual reporting of people on the ground were these very loaded, guided questions for a specific narrative. Now, that's not a lot of detail, right? He got very simple quotes from people. So to get more detail, here's what happens. And you'll notice this. It's like you'll open a story with a quote from somebody on the ground. You'll make a couple of broad generalizations about what this represents. And then we get the academics. There is, I guarantee you, if not an actual Rolodex that everybody gets when they're a foreign correspondent in China or DPRK or elsewhere, it's functionally a Rolodex of reliable sources.
Yeah.
And these sources tend to be people that are based in the West. Maybe they spent a couple years in China. Maybe they actually have a PhD, so they know the language. But these are people, who are insulated in the same kind of bubble that the reporters are in.
Yeah.
And this is where they go for their detailed quotes about stuff. So they'll call a professor in London or somewhere or in the U.S. and be like, what do you think about this? And they'll give kind of their canned answer that always happens to reflect the narrative of dictatorship and party rule and non-democratic structure and all this stuff. And that's where they get the meat of their quotes from. So they've got the actual reporting they were doing for like 30 seconds. And then for the rest of it, they need to justify whatever ad hoc position they want to take on this story. They get the academic to talk at length about betrayal of revolutionary values. There's a reliable guy who thinks that China is anti-Maoist and has abandoned Mao. That gets called. You see his name pop up. You see. I can't remember the guy's name in London, but he's a reliable person as far as party rule, and he's always very, very, very trustworthy in terms of giving the canned narrative back to the reporter. Like, the reporter might as well just be asking, "Hey, give me what I want."
Right.
And then they give them what they want.
And I think, like, we covered this a bit in the decline of the university system in the West episode that we did, but as time has gone on and as funding has been cut from universities, in order for people to pay for their research that they want to do, they need to get funding from private sources, from companies, from foundations, from NGOs, or from individual wealthy people. And if they're going to do that, then they're certainly not going to talk about communism or socialism or anything in that realm in a positive light,
Sure.
regardless of what form it takes. And people who are ideologically more likely to toe that line are more likely to get funding and therefore more likely to, rise to the top of that system. So,
Sure.
I mean, it's
this is true, but it's also not even taking into consideration that the think tank industrial complex in D.C. You go back and look at these. You look at these organizations, these supposedly objective, academic, reliable, scholarly organizations, and they were either founded directly as an anti-Soviet organization. Like the Jamestown Foundation is a big resource for a lot of reporters.
Right.
And it was explicitly founded as a way of giving voices to Soviet dissidents. Like they were the publishing arm of the dissident groups in countries outside the Soviet Union. These places get their money from National Endowment for Democracy, which is just the CIA with different letters, NED instead of CIA.
Right.
The late great William Blum wrote a great piece about that relationship, and he tells that story better than I can. So just look up William Blum, National Endowment for Democracy, and you can find that. But yeah, I mean, like here's the thing too. I mean, I work for a state organization, right? I work for a state media outlet. I don't think that being state media immediately disqualifies you from consideration. I think that there is such a thing as there can be, at least, such a thing as a good state media. I mean, I certainly think so in countries that are governed by communist parties, because I think they have the welfare of the majority of the population, the working class, above the capitalists. But even putting that aside, I don't discredit NPR, even BBC to some extent, on the basis of their state funding.
I think additionally something
Yeah.
something important to bring up is also, well, maybe I'm just sensitive to this as a non-white, non-male person, but I think it's really disheartening to see that the quote-unquote expert opinions are also from Western sources, often
Sure.
white male opinion, and that rather than taking the opinions and the experiences of people on the grounds of these villages, they bring in some academic, like bourgeois, like white opinion to give validity to their opinion and to their biases, basically. Like all of these biases are backed by bourgeois white male bias.
Yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
I mean, you look at the names of the people, and it's like Jude and Doug and
I mean, and even
Reginald.
even if it is someone, okay, so God, hot take. No. Even if they try to bring in, like white people love to bring in a little ethnic spice, quote unquote, gross. But even so, it's like, oh, this is Dr. So-and-so from the University of London. He's basically, integrated into the Western ideology.
Yeah. Like totally inculcated in the ideology and the system, right? Like,
Exactly.
it's. I mean, not that we shouldn't take their experience into consideration, but these are, and this is a larger point I can get to in a minute. But the thing I was saying is that BBC and those kind of supposedly objective sources, I mean, I think they do a lot of bad reporting. Right?
Full disclosure, BBC is funded by the British government.
What?
Yeah. I think they do a lot of bad reporting for a lot of different reasons, but I don't dismiss them simply because of their relationship to the state. Who I do dismiss, the places I do dismiss, are the ones that are specifically like anti-communist think tanks and organizations, right? Like they have a specific ideological agenda that's not a secret, but then their employees and their reporters and the researchers all keep it a secret, right? They don't talk about their biases because that would discredit their work. Which it should.
Right. Right.
It absolutely should. So there's a lot of really terrible reporting from the BBC in those places for the same reasons that there's terrible reporting and research from the think tanks. But I am less inclined to dismiss them out of hand. I will read something from BBC or NPR with some interest. Now, if it's crap, then it's crap. But I don't. Yeah, I don't just write them off totally. But for like Radio Free Asia, There's no reason to take anything you read there seriously. They had a story about how DPRK people were getting crystal meth for Lunar New Year just a couple weeks ago. Like it's
Hell yeah.
And then before that there was a story about how Kim Jong Un has demanded a certain degree of a certain amount of human manure every day to boost agriculture, and the amount was I think 10 times what the average human produces in terms of waste every day. It's
because you haven't met me.
Oh God.
I just it's
That's like Trump's like daily like 3 McDonald's burgers thing.
It's so funny because we talk frequently about Orientalism and how that's so prevalent within Western ideology and how a lot of these places approach topics like this, but like talking about like, oh, the people within the DPRK are looking for meth for Chinese New Year, like we have significant meth issues within the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
that are
Fuck
never
yeah.
reported
Oh, yeah.
on, and if they are, it's to vilify the people that are within systems that operate in poverty that use the drug. And then we also have a leader that like does dumb shit and eats stupid things and says stupid things every fucking day. But then you either have liberal outlets that will say, oh, well, like, look at this guy. He's an idiot, like fucking Trump, orange man, whatever. And then you have the Republicans that will support him. And anytime there's actual criticism about like, hey, this dude's a fucking moron, look at these things, it's lost in this like noise of pointing fingers. And,
it's because his policies are not significantly different from Barack Obama
right.
or from George W. Bush. As much as liberals want to pretend they are, the camps in which children were kept opened in 2014 and 2015, which, if you will remember, were under the presidency of Barack Obama. So
that great progressive icon,
the great
Barack
progressive socialist, Muslim, whatever.
He was going to bring
Marxist Senator
communism to the
Kennedy.
He was going to bring communism to the
Yeah.
U.S., but he couldn't get that third term secured. So
yeah, I wish. Got it.
Wasn't he
Yeah,
going to
I mean,
change like the laws so he could get the third term?
yes,
or
that's
whatever?
what I heard. But we must look at Donald Trump as an anomaly, and we must look at him as an exception. But really,
Sure.
the difference between him and the previous presidents we've had is that he talks like an asshole. I mean, that's really the major difference. If he was well spoken,
Yeah. I mean,
Different
he's rude. He's
Right.
rude.
He's
to
not
me.
even the
Like,
first
that's-
one to
That's
do that.
the disagreement.
And what that does is that essentially gives these liberal outlets and just other outlets in general a way to try and hide the blatant Western supremacy that they're pushing and the absolute fucking racist narratives that they
For sure.
provide. And that's like it's
Yeah.
they were
Yeah,
they
I
were
mean,
much
I
more
was
subtle about it.
I was talking about this last night with somebody, that this, the great victory, right? The great victory for free press and journalism in the U.S. especially was Watergate, right? Like the reporters brought down a president, right? They told truth to power. They finally, they won the good fight, etc. And it's like, okay, you got rid of the figure of Richard Nixon. The U.S. didn't stop being corrupt.
Right.
It didn't stop being a capitalist hellhole. It didn't stop. Like, Nixon didn't even go to jail. He got pardoned.
Right.
Right. Like, what were his consequences? He lived the rest of his life in Yorba Linda. Oh my God, what a terrible fate. And then eventually became an elder statesman taken seriously by the wonk community and the think tank assholes in D.C. Like, he got totally rehabilitated. What was the big, like, he didn't go to, like, people didn't go to jail, right? What was the big consequences for the bankers who perpetuated the financial crisis in 2008?
And
They got their golden parachutes and they moved on to a job at a different firm where they got paid millions of dollars.
Exactly.
Right? Like, nobody went to, like, the brave reporting doesn't actually accomplish anything in terms of changing the way the system operates and the fundamentals of that
Exactly.
system.
Because
well, and I guarantee
But
you, if
what it does give you is this greater false credibility, right?
yeah.
Because the victory of journalism, right? So we have this great free press.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it all feeds back into the broader ideology, and liberalism and capital are very good at absorbing new threats to its ideology into itself. Like, it's a self-perpetuating system.
And how many comparisons do we hear, like, to Nixon as like a, even Nixon had progressive ideas, like
Well,
blah
and
blah
that's-
blah.
yeah,
that's the
Like,
thing
Oh my
is
God,
that you have this issue
Stephen fucking Colbert has a Nixon portrait up in his office.
that's ludicrous. But there's just this issue with the rewriting of history or like the dimming of historical fact and precedent, which is why, like, when American or Western outlets will talk about the like red tourism and all these things in this diminutive light, we don't understand and appreciate and approach history in a material sense in the U.S., especially through our media. And that's evident in, like, oh, did you see that George Bush is painting puppies? Like, that's so cool. And, like, it completely negates all the issues that actually existed within his presidency and what he
Reagan
did.
was, even though I disagree with his policy, he was a good Republican.
Right. Well, he was a good,
Yeah.
Christian American, and he was a real patriot, and so he did these good things, and it completely whitewashes the terrible legacy that every fucking president has ever had.
Whoever comes
Yeah,
in
I mean,
after Donald Trump will pardon him.
Oh, and that's what I was going to say that
pardon
earlier.
him.
Like Bernie Sanders, if he gets elected in 2020,
He'll pardon Donald
God
Trump.
help us all, but he'll pardon Donald Trump.
He does, I mean, every incoming
No,
president.
no. I will say that. I mean, Bernie Sanders winning would be a victory for chauvinism, sure, but but it's also, yeah. I talked about this the other day. I think it's an opportunity, right? There is a base of support that exists there that is going to be totally turned off by whatever compromises he inevitably makes, right? So recruitment is the goal here, I think, in terms of like actual, socialist and communist movements they don't need to be, doing campaign work, but you do need to be, receptive to these people. And because, we talked about how the ideology incorporates at every level and it gets internalized. So these are people that are deeply consumed by it, and they're just now maybe breaking out of it, and it's going to take a lot of work.
Full disclosure,
But yeah, I mean,
Ian
I
Goodrum
totally
is
agree,
paid
right?
not only by the CPC but also by the DSA.
There's that quote by Lenin that said that he supports the Mensheviks in as much as the noose supports the hangman, or the criminal, or something like that. That basically he wants these people to get power so that he can then demonstrate how useless they are and how shitty they are.
Right, exactly. I mean, yeah, when Bernie Sanders signs the bill to bomb the hell out of Syria or give, whatever to Israel to continue to settling in Gaza, if the coup hasn't already happened in Venezuela, then supporting our brave boys. If it has already happened, supporting our brave boys in Venezuela, or giving sweet deals to the sham government, like he'll do these things, and I do think the consciousness has evolved to a certain level where that will be seen as unacceptable by a good number of people. So that's my 2 cents. I try to avoid American politics because I'm not there anymore, and it's so great. It's so great not to be there. But
I'm a little jealous, though.
Super jealous.
But yeah, I mean, like, especially with the poverty village, right? Like, this is an example of a concrete benefit for people that have been, I mean, they've had, they've had their lives and they've had their traditions, but I mean, it's, the rest of the world was living a certain way, and they weren't getting the benefit of that, and now they are. And this is like an obvious good, right? This is a direct and clear improvement to quality of life, but that doesn't get reported as that. It gets reported as this insidious kind of campaign to put sea portraits up in every home, and like everybody's got to show their, like, it's like they think that when they leave, people are going to start bowing down to the sea picture and not just living their regular lives, right?
Right.
But at the same time, like, you can also understand why the picture is, I mean, also, we haven't interrogated why the picture is there. We don't know whether the people in the houses put it up or whether it was already there. There's no investigation there.
Yeah, I mean,
but
it's
even
no
if
different. So what if if you walk up to somebody with a MAGA hat and you're like, you just flip on the mic and you're like, hey, why are you wearing that MAGA hat? Like, how do you feel about Donald Trump? Then whatever they say is going to seem like, like they worship Donald Trump, right? And if you take that quote completely out of context, like, it's never led in with, oh, I asked him about why he had a MAGA hat on, then it's going to sound like, oh my God, like Americans are brainwashed into, thinking that Donald Trump is, Jesus or whatever.
Well,
Well,
it would be accurate,
it's a question of self-selection too, right? Because you're picking the guy with the hat,
Right.
Exactly.
And if
Which
you
I-
ask,
which I
The
think
person
exists-
with the
yeah.
G picture on their wall.
if you ask enough people, somebody's going to give you a dumb answer. Somebody's going to give you an answer that feeds into whatever you wanted
It's
to
like
say.
that fucking when oh shit, what the fuck was it? The golf club late night show guy. What was his name?
David Letterman.
Yeah, so David Letterman, he would go.
The late night golf club guy. I knew what he was fucking talking about. This is how long we've been brothers.
Thanks, Tim. Our entire lives.
Yeah.
My entire life, anyway.
Yeah, so
but anyway, so yeah, no, he would go onto the streets and ask like stupid questions and get stupid answers.
Right.
But that they asked like 100 fucking people to get one stupid answer.
Right.
And then it makes, of course it's like a joke show. We live in the US, we know that it's a joke. But if you take that one interview and use it as like, oh, this is the portrayal of what Americans are, then of course it's going to look like we know nothing, which I mean, most Americans know nothing,
Right.
but you know what I mean?
You make it fit.
Yeah,
your
yeah,
scheme.
yeah. Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Journalists act like they're conduits for the news. They're these perfect ciphers for pure, unadulterated information.
freedom of the
or
press.
pure, or Yeah, pure unadulterated truth is being channeled through them to you, the people, how benevolent we are. But you're making choices. You're making choices to talk to certain people, to use certain quotes. I mean, I've done this too. When I worked for local newspapers in Texas, I was profiling like this, some church event or whatever. Not a big story. Not like something that really affects how people view an entire country. But if I didn't get a good quote from somebody, if I didn't get a quote I thought I could use that didn't pop enough for me, I would go talk to somebody else.
Sure.
Right? I would. You do that. It's normal. It's totally normal journalistic practice, but it's not talked about that much, right?
Right.
We because the journalists want to present themselves as these conduits for pure objectivity when that could not be further from the truth. And the other thing about like self-selection that I haven't gone into that much, foreign correspondents especially. Like I mentioned, Anna Fifield, she was in Pyongyang for a couple of years or so. I don't think she became fluent in Korean, for example, but now she's in China. Tom Phillips was in China. I don't think I
Call the
sincerely doubt
fuck
he became
out.
fluent in Chinese. It's a difficult language. I doubt he learned it in like the 2 or 3 years he was here, and now he's in Mexico and reporting on Venezuela. These people don't stay in one place for very long. For the most part, you'll get some long timers, and they're better, but they're still subject to the same biases.
Right.
But by its nature, right, the foreign correspondent position is a position in flux, right? You don't know where you're going to be 2 years from now. You might be sent to the Middle East, you might be sent to Africa, you might be sent to South America. There's just no telling what you're going to do, and so, and part of this is because funding for these long-term foreign correspondents is limited too, for the same reasons that funding for better academics is limited, and the people that get grants are getting grants from the government and defense contractors and what have you. If a think tank isn't funded by the government, it's funded by Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Northrop Grumman or some of these monstrous firms. But the journalists are only there for a limited time. They're not embedded in the place. They're not spending time on the ground either, because if you're in China, you're usually in Beijing or Shanghai, which makes sense. Beijing is the political capital of the country. Shanghai is the economic capital of the country. So you're in the major cities, right? And you're almost totally in the expat sectors. This guy at the New York Times kind of gave the game away when he wrote a story about all the propaganda posters I see on the way to work, and he counted all the propaganda banners that he saw and all the posters and all the Communist Party stuff he saw, and he counted like 20 something banners or whatever. But he started from home, and where he started was the biggest expat sector in Beijing, Sanlitun, where where a lot of expats live, a lot of wealthier Chinese live, and so this is obviously where he lives. And I'm sorry, but I socialize there sometimes. I try to avoid it like the plague when I can, but I do go there on occasion because I have expat friends and they want to go there because they're expats. And I don't speak the language fluently yet. That's the other thing. I mean, when I get fluency, I'm probably leaving that goddamn place behind forever. But that's the thing, right? He gave the game away by saying exactly where he lives, and I've been there. I know it's a bubble. It's absolutely a bubble. The expats you talk to are all going to be journalists or media workers in some capacity, or entrepreneurs trying to exploit the Chinese people, having a very difficult time of it because of the way China's set up. But that's another story. I think Ty talked about this in the episode about China that you guys did.
Yeah, the people who were like disappointed that they couldn't make money hand over fist like they wanted to, so they came back to the States.
Yeah. I mean, it's always framed as labor costs are too high, which translation, workers are treated too good.
Sad.
Right, exactly.
Sad.
And so yeah, this guy was showing that this is where he lives, right? So this is where he socializes, this is where he goes out, this is where he spends most of his time. And this is true for Shanghai, certainly. This is true for if you're in Venezuela, you're in the wealthier sections of Caracas, probably. You're going to be surrounded by, even if you come in with pure intentions, right? Even if you don't come in with a specific ideological goal, and most people do, whether they realize it or not. They come in because they want to shed the light of truth on these poor, blighted people, these poor, suffering people who are under the boot of this ruthless, terrible, authoritarian communist government. This is what they want to do. And they either explicitly or implicitly vocalize this in their social media. Like, this is another way to see how people really are, people's biases. But you're surrounded by wealthy expats, who are there enjoying the luxuries, and you're there with wealthier Chinese who are more likely, admittedly, to be critical of the government, right? And if you're a foreigner, you're also sought out for that reason too. So it's a self-selecting group just being a foreigner in China, but especially being in these places, right? Just the other night, I was in Sanlitun, and I know better than to drop the C bomb and bring up communism. But I did, and he looked at me, and
Me
and
everywhere.
he looked at me like I had a third eye, right? And he began to tell me how the Soviet Union had no art and so on and so forth, like all these myths. And of course, I said, the Soviet film industry was the greatest in the history of the world, but that's a different subject. But my point being, you're surrounded by these people all the time, and you're not attuned to it if you're not coming at it from an oppositional point of ideology. Like, if I related these people as just regular people, right, and didn't talk about politics, then I might not see this. But I bring it up because I don't feel the kind of pressure or the kind of nervousness about bringing up my politics here that I did back in the U.S.
Right.
Because Chinese people are interested in that. They want to know why you're a communist, because they don't encounter too many from the West, and especially from the U.S. But expats are just like, they can't believe it. Like they're truly shocked. But that's the attitudes that you encounter in those places. And so if that's your day-to-day life, right? If you're surrounded at work by reporters who think a certain way about China, if your social life is filled with these people, if the Chinese people you talk about this stuff, you're going to start thinking, well, everybody thinks this way.
Right.
Everybody believes this stuff. Then you start thinking there's a huge critical mass of people out there who want a big change, who want the Communist Party to go. And that in turn continues to influence your writing, because then it becomes a real crusade, right? Then it becomes like, I can really change things. But the reality is, the base of support is in the smaller cities and the rural areas, and in the bigger cities too. I mean, there's still a big working class in the city that supports the Communist Party and the government. Like, that's who's there. But if you don't go out to the rural areas and you don't take these people seriously and take what they have to say seriously and use them as something and think of them as something other than like a repository for simple quotes, then you're going to start thinking this way.
Yeah.
And I mean, and the numbers bear this out too. I mean, the central government, when polled independently even, gets 80 to 90% approval. Now, that is a lot. It's quite a lot of people. But you think about the fact that it's a country of almost 1.5 billion people, and you realize that 90% means 10% don't have confidence or don't support, and that means like over 100 million people.
Sure.
Right? That's or 100 to 200 million. So that's still a lot of people. So you're going to encounter some people who say these things. That does not mean it reflects the national mood. It doesn't reflect an actual broader trend. But again, if that's your environment, you're going to think that's how it is, and then that'll influence how you write.
I'm gonna write an article about all of the capitalist propaganda that I see on my way to work. All the billboards, all the signs, all of the
support the
radio
police
commercials,
billboards.
all
Oh,
of
God.
all of that. I'm gonna take down. every
I
single
see
example.
at least 15 real estate signs on my way to work.
Sure.
What about advertisements as propaganda?
Oh, that
Like,
is
how many-
propaganda. I mean, what
Right,
else
it
is
is
it?
propaganda.
Like how many marketing ploys do you see just scrolling through Facebook or something like that? Like any internet site.
And if you
where
want to
there's
talk about
advertisements,
dystopia,
sure,
the
they'll-
fact that it'll advertise things that you talked about with your friends
Right,
to
yeah.
you,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and I mean, and that's just one aspect of the culture too. I mean, of course, there's this huge culture industry that reflects the ideology too,
Right.
even in ostensibly kind of left wing Hollywood, right?
Yes.
The critiques that exist in major films, the films that people actually see, is limited to like specific bad guys, right? There's no fundamental critique that happens.
Yeah.
So I mean, similarly, again, it's the same phenomenon, right? But because we lived in this environment and we came up with it, and it's only through kind of coming to Marxism and communism that we're able to see these things for what they are. It's like the glasses from They Live, right? Like,
Right.
to use a crude kind of analogy, you put on the glasses and suddenly everything starts to make a lot more sense. So you might not see the obey banner up on the wall, but you watch a news report or you watch a movie and you say, okay, I know what this is trying to do.
Right.
And so that becomes your view of the world, because you're seeing things that people. And it's not a superior kind of thing. It's everybody can learn this if they open up and they put on the glasses themselves. They're right there for everybody to enjoy. It's you just have to.
I don't know about enjoy.
You have to.
I think once you become a communist,
okay,
you can't enjoy
yeah.
anything
Not
anymore.
enjoy.
Yeah, there's no more
awareness.
enjoyment left in our lives.
Not in the
Yeah,
capitalist.
yeah, it would. It would be a lot easier to be a Pollyanna optimist about
Right,
the state of things
right.
in the U.S. and the rest of the capitalist world. But yeah, but you get my meaning. It's possible to put them on and then be miserable for the rest of your life.
Pretty much, yeah.
But you got to break through this huge barrier, and it's difficult to do. That's why building movements and building revolution is hard.
Right. Right.
Because the system is set up to suppress it, whether it's direct state repression like we got in the 30s and 40s against the Communist Party versus, the more subtle, insidious ways of censorship that we get now.
So I know we moved pretty quickly into the modern era, but I think we kind of left off in World War II when we were talking about history. Do you know much about the reporting, or if you could speak on a little bit of the reporting during the period of the Sino-Soviet split, and how that was reflective, I guess, of U.S. policy or Western ideology?
Yeah, I mean, even during the split, right after '49, and after the Kuomintang retreated to Taiwan, and they were protected by the U.S. military, and so the Civil War couldn't actually be completed. Like as far as Taiwan goes, there's a clear winner in the war. Like it's obvious who that territory belongs to. But
there's a lot of young Taiwanese, by the way, who are pro-communist and pro-unification of Taiwan and China, which is really
it's cool to see.
rad.
It's been cool to see that. Yeah. But there's still even during the split, right? I mean, I think it took a while for the media and the press to follow the lead of Nixon and Kissinger, right? Because they saw an opportunity to exploit this kind of division for their own ends, right? And we can talk about the foreign policy of China during that era. It's not great.
Right.
After the rapprochement with the U.S., Pinochet was famously went to China and got support.
Big yikes.
Yeah.
Late Mao was yikes.
Yeah, but I still take the position that Mao was good.
Sure. Same.
Extremely good, in fact. And but even before the trip to China, I mean, there was still this division between so-called Red China and so-called Free China, right? I watched the presidential debate for the Democratic primary between Hubert Humphrey and John F. Kennedy in 1960 the other day, because I was curious about what the attitudes were at the time. And they, of course, still, they said Red China.
Right.
They didn't just say China; they said Red China to divide it against Free China, right? The Republic of China, the breakaway government of Taiwan as being this legitimate oppositional force. And for through the early 1970s, the PRC wasn't recognized by the UN.
Right.
Right. It was the ROC, and it took a long time, and it took, again, Africa, right? The only reason why China even got its seat on the Security Council and in the UN is because a huge number of African nations voted for China because of the support China gave during the anti-colonial independence struggles.
Nice.
They saw China as an ally. But that's what it took, right? It took this commitment to revolutionary movement and revolutionary struggle to even get China a seat at the table. So for a long time, I mean, the reporting was just like you would see about the Soviet Union, dictatorship, blah, 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 etc. I mean, again, the more things change, the more things stay the same. There was a bit of a softening after the Nixon visit, but I mean, and to be fair, I haven't read a whole lot of contemporary reporting to that time, because in terms of how China was framed, I mean, it was framed as like, this potential future ally reaching out and all this and that. Yeah. But even after the reform era, after Mao's passing and the passing of reforms, you can look at the profiling of leaders and the country then, when supposedly China was this great ally of the capitalist world. Of course, it never was, but this is the myth. And yeah, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, like the leaders before Xi, were still framed in this kind of dictator, anti-democratic,
right,
etc. Like they say things are getting better, but and they always qualify whatever praise they give with this very, very scary kind of characterization that you could practically copy and paste.
Yeah.
When they talk about Xi, because it's the same narrative, right?
Anytime there is something positive which happens in China, it's always as a result of the free markets and of capitalism. And whenever anything bad happens in China, it's always a result of communism and the dictatorship which exists under Xi. So nothing has changed.
Yeah. I mean, so the tenor of the reporting was a little softer, but it was. I mean, that alliance was always an alliance of convenience, and I mean, we can talk about what kind of error it was. Yes. I think it certainly was, but this was a situation that China felt it had to reach out this way, and so there was a reason for that. There was a motive for that, but even with that, I mean, it's clear that it wasn't. They never were trusted, right? There was this kind of racist assumption that they can't be trusted, and so. I mean, if the U.S. had engaged China in good faith, right, and hadn't tried to dictate the terms of its opening up and dictate the terms of its governance to itself, and obviously try to push for Western style democracy, that they're doing now, but they were doing, decades before. That never
Yeah.
changed. Always wanted to change the political system because they knew changing the political system would break down the unity of the country
Yeah.
and allow it to be more easily exploited. China has been able to develop and grow on its own terms, right? This is the difference between a colonial subject and a sovereign nation,
Yes.
right? This is why Marxists support, even if it's not explicitly socialist, they support anti-colonial independence struggles because this is a way to weaken the kind of grip of the imperial capitalist cartel.
Well,
right?
some
Yes,
Marxists.
yeah. I mean, sure. Okay, maybe I'm giving people too much credit,
Yeah.
but this logically makes sense, right? So even if it's not an explicitly socialist or communist movement, you analyze the situation and you direct your resources and support accordingly. So same deal with China. I mean, it's it represents a different kind of approach, which is why a lot of African countries are interested in support from China because it represents a new path. But that could be its own show.
Right.
Hell
There's a whole
yeah.
episode on that.
We should do a whole episode on
On the
that.
Belt and Road Initiative, yes, please.
Yeah. But
me
the thing,
up.
yeah, I mean that's the thing, right? There was never any real trust. Like I think if there was never any real trust because the U.S. can't do that, right? There are fundamental contradictions between the imperialist camp and even if it's engaging in this kind of rapprochement or détente, the communist or socialist camp, right?
Right.
These are fundamental ideological differences that can't be reconciled. And so, the capitalists in the U.S. knew this better than anybody, and the capitalists in the U.S. know this now.
Yeah.
Some of the most accurate resources for knowing what China's doing now and how it relates to the capitalist world, and some of the best arguments for why it's not a capitalist country come from like the Wall Street Journal or Barron's or these these right wing rags, right, that are shitty, but these are the people that are trying to do business and failing because of the way the economy works in China. And so in many ways they're a better resource than some of the leftist publications. Now you should read them critically like you would read any right wing garbage.
Right.
But there is truth in there, right? There is some reality that's reflected in there, and you can take what you can take what's useful and leave the rest. You can leave the anti-communist propaganda aside. Well, you can leave some of the anti-communist propaganda aside about the political system and the dictatorship and whatnot, and read about how the economy is actually functioning,
one
which is also anti-communist.
of the
propaganda,
best
right? Because it's
sources for
negative.
information on the gulags is the CIA, because they're not going to lie. This was
Yeah.
meant to be a secret document. I mean, they're full of shit. I mean, fuck the CIA. So anybody that
Sure.
they support in terms of propaganda, you can toss that aside. But you can look at
Yeah.
the objective examples of what is good within these organizations, because when they are speaking in a manner which supports sort of a positive view of whatever it is they're discussing in the in this case socialist economics.
They did the same thing with calorie intake in the
Yes,
Soviet Union
yeah.
as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If it's meant to be internal memos for the CIA, you can trust that they were serious and sincere.
To some degree, yeah.
If they're being
But I mean,
positive, for sure.
Yeah. But that's the thing, right? These are people who know who their enemies are,
Yes.
right? They understand clearer than maybe some parts of the left who the real enemy is,
Yeah.
right? The conflict is between the imperialist camp represented by the U.S. and the anti-imperialist camp that every country who's not allied or a direct kind of client of the U.S. can theoretically be a part of or is already a part of, right? It's not there's not a structural organization of anti-imperialism, but there is there are these relationships between countries.
Right.
And so, these right wingers know the relationship and know the contradiction that exists, and so say these are the bad guys. And they're right that those are their bad guys. They're not bad guys, but they're their bad guys, right? Like those are their enemies. So they're going to be clear-eyed and honest about it. The same way that the right wingers will dishonestly, but will report on like a social democratic politician as being this opponent of capitalism, which is not accurate, but it would represent something of a change in terms of benefits for the working class, and so that scares them, and so they go on an all-out offensive. So I mean, you get more accurate pictures from people who know what the stakes are and what the rivalries are and what the conditions are. And I think there's a lot of confusion on the ostensibly left side of the spectrum as to who the enemies are. I mean, you'll get people that will attack. They'll try to be even-handed about it, but they'll attack. They'll attack Venezuela, Cuba, China, DPRK, to a lesser extent Vietnam, in this attempt to be kind of even-handed and honest and nuanced with their opinions. But you're living in a society where the dominant narrative is opposed to these countries and not opposed to the U.S. or its allies. And so the critique that you give for the targeted countries will always hit harder than the critique you give for the imperial core countries, right? So there's some confusion there where you try to be even-handed and attack X, Y, or Z country in a way to look fair and impartial,
Sure.
but you end up carrying water for the people who already know what the conflict is.
Yeah.
But as far as the reporting during that era, I mean, there were some differences. Like there was talk of reform and all that, especially during Deng Xiaoping's administration. But I mean, '89 really disabused people of that notion, right? Because this was an incident where there was an attempt to kind of dismantle and fracture the country, and it was shut down. And then that was the end of it, right? Like there was never any real trust or honesty about China's relationship with the U.S. In terms of it being positive, and then that put the last nail in the coffin.
Sure.
Yeah, but I mean, like the China supported the Mujahideen the same time as the U.S. supported the Mujahideen.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Bad call.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, pretty objectively.
So, do you like how much time do you spend in like the rural areas, or like you were talking about the expat areas? Like how much time do you spend outside of those areas?
Not as much as I'd like. Definitely. I'm subject to these same phenomena, even if I recognize them for what they are. Right? You encounter it, and you do. You are kind of surrounded by it, whether you want to be or not. So I mean, but part of it is just because I don't speak the language well enough yet. That venturing out into the cool neighborhoods where the old guys are playing mahjong isn't so possible right now. But in the future, I definitely want to do that because they rule. Those guys are super cool. But I live in Beijing, and I get out to the rural areas sometimes, usually as part of like a work trip. But not as much as I like. Yeah, I do want to spend more time in these places because these are the places where a lot of the real big changes are still happening. So I freely admit, I spend time in a major city, and there is a certain comfort to having those neighborhoods around, like the Western type neighborhoods and places around, like. But I recognize that for being, kind of a form of cowardice and a form of like, it's an easy thing to do to go to the familiar place, and so I'm trying to rectify that a bit. But it's going to take time.
So I think a good way to kind of like bring this all together is where do we stand and where can we stand as principled Marxists in shutting down the anti-communist rhetoric and the stigmas that exist within parts of the left that paint China in a light that is completely ignorant of what it is doing and what it has done and what it is pushing to do. And how do you feel media fits into that? Like, how do we move past where we're at now, where a lot of the left, and especially a lot of the Western and American left in general, that don't exist within like a Marxist-Leninist camp, how do we approach that and like deconstruct that and move forward and support China and the party and President Xi Jinping, and how do we do that best now and in the immediate future?
Well, I mean, it's difficult because like we talked about before, you've got all of these forces working against you. If this is your goal, I don't know. I mean, for me, it's very clear who the primary actor is in terms of imperialism, right? Like, there's no question who has 800 bases around the world while the rest of the world has a cumulative 30. Who pours money into their military, who continues to support kind of neocolonialism and imperialist policy abroad, who continues to foment anti-democratic coups in places like Venezuela, who continues to invade, who continues to do all these things. Like, it's obvious, right? But the way some people would have it is, yeah. But the way that some people would have it is that they spend all their time talking about China, like as if China's in any way equivalent to any of that, right? Like it's so. I mean, the fault lines are there, right? The divisions are very clear in terms of what one country is doing versus another country, and I mean that's an easy point of argument because again the difference is for the same reason that like in the Israel Palestine people say conflict, which is bullshit. It's a genocide or close to it. You look at the deaths of Palestinians versus the death of Israeli soldiers, and it's like 2 to hundreds, right? Like the difference is very clear, and I think the same is true for the U.S. versus everybody else, right? There's no comparison to any other country what the U.S. does, and so that's the primary conflict, right? That's the primary thing we need to be resolving. But that's maybe not as easy for people to stomach. Um, I would I don't know. I mean, when you read media, there's things you can pull from media outlets that are adversarial that can be, there's useful information there that you have to recontextualize. Okay, so for example, um, there is similar to the poverty village, right? Like you can recontextualize that as a positive project that's doing good things for the people of the country as opposed to this building up of a cult of personality, right? You can take the other side with the same information. But especially, I think there's another good example of this. There's a development, an urban development happening southwest of here in Hebei province called Xiong'an, and it's meant to siphon away some of the population of Beijing because Beijing is a very crowded city. It's got over 20 million people, and the long-term goal is to bring 5 million people out of that population and into the population of Xiong'an. So what's happening is state-owned enterprise headquarters are moving there. Non-essential functions of the government are moving there. You've got big changes happening in this area, and the way this has been framed by everybody, is this is like Xi's personal project, like it's his prestige project, right? This is his shining example of his governance and his rule and so on, enshrining, again, the personality cult, the dictatorship, so on and so forth. The details don't get mentioned because it would be too good for China to mention the details, because here are the details. Xiong'an is a centrally planned community built from the ground up specifically for convenience for the population, the working population of that area, to the degree that wherever you work, that determines where your housing is, because the housing is public. There's no housing market here at all. It's all public housing. It's all heavily subsidized. You have an option to buy after 10 years. After 10 years of renting at very low rates. I don't know how low the rates are going to be yet because we haven't gotten those details yet.
But how do you buy if everybody's living in the same apartment?
but the housing is assigned for this reason, because for several reasons, not just because they don't want speculation and a rampant housing market where prices go up and up and up. There's no market, right? They're eliminating the market entirely from this system, this essential good. But also, what this does is, because you're assigned housing based on your employment, the plan is that every essential service, like hospitals, schools, shopping, entertainment, so on, and of course your place of work, are within 15 minutes subway ride from wherever you are in your district of the city.
Sounds authoritarian.
Yeah. So the idea is that you're not. There are people. Here's a big problem in Beijing, that some people who live here have to live way far away from where they work, and they have long commutes, and it's really really tough. It's not good. That's a big problem, and it's part of that's due to the overcrowding and the speculation in the housing market, where housing costs are going up and up and up. So this is a way to siphon that population away and create a new system of urban development, right? Like where there is no speculation. Even if you buy your home after 10 years and you decide to sell, the right of first refusal as far as purchasing goes to the government. The government is the first purchaser, and they'll buy your house for a certain amount above whatever you paid for it, whatever payments you made on it. So you're making money off selling whatever your residence is, but it's going right back into this government system of public housing.
So
right? So there's
where is this in relation to the city center?
Beijing?
Yeah. Like how far from the main sort of central Beijing is it?
It is about, I think, a 30-minute train ride from
Shit.
Beijing.
I mean, that
It's
that
pretty
alone
close.
has to undermine the market in Beijing, right?
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's a sign based on employment. So I mean,
okay,
you can't buy housing
right,
there,
right.
right? If you're some guy, you can't just buy a house or an apartment in
But you
Xiong'an.
can't
Like to
you
the point
can't
where
rent in Shuang and then commute to Beijing.
I don't think
Okay,
so.
well, never mind.
But
I was
this is
excited,
the other thing too,
but
right?
never mind.
Well, no, because it's because this is part of the big project. Beijing, Tianjin, Hebei are all very close to each other, and so the idea is to integrate this place into like a mega city
Sure.
almost. And if Xiong'an is successful, and I think it will be, because you're removing the problem that caused the rise in housing costs. Then I think that the other places will follow
Yeah.
suit, and because the government can do that, it will happen. Right? They have the capacity to make this happen, to totally remove the housing market from this massive metropolis, and apply it, as an example, as a blueprint to the rest of the country.
Well, and I suppose
But
if you
again,
pull 5 million people out of the city, that's got to drop some prices in terms of like
yeah,
competition
yeah.
for homes.
Yeah, it'll have that effect, but I think if Xiong'an is going to be a model, then it's going to be seen as a positive kind of model, and and the government will say, hey, let's just do this everywhere.
Sure.
And I think it'll be slowly incorporated. I mean, I think this is part of the goals, the long term goals of the country, right? That there's a problem. Housing is expensive. There's a ridiculous market and speculation. This is a problem stemming precisely from the market systems, the very limited market systems that exist in China. China says we're at a place where we can get rid of this and make this no longer a problem, and they do it, right?
Yeah.
So, but this is not how the development is framed as this personal project, prestige project for Xi, which feeds back into this narrative of dictatorship.
Yeah.
So you don't get a full picture of the situation. You have to delve deep, like, and it's harder if you don't speak or read Chinese, right?
Yeah.
I can read some things, and so I can read a little bit, but I'm not at the level where I can read like government documents in their full detail yet. And I think I could get a lot more information out of that when I get to that level. So, but obviously, learning Chinese is difficult, and I'm not saying go out and learn Chinese to get a better picture. But you can look, like, you can take a critical look and delve deeper. I would recommend doing the game of checking sources, right?
Sure.
Like if there's a story that cites, this is the other thing, right? That if one semi-respectable outlet publishes a story on something, then everybody else can report that story because that first place reported it, and they can cite the original reporter. And so you get this like cat and mouse game of trying to find the original
Right.
source.
Which is what I mentioned earlier. Like you backtrack and
Sure.
backtrack and backtrack, and eventually
Yeah.
it's radio free fucking Asia. Every fucking time.
Yeah, or an academic paper that doesn't say what the story is saying it says, right? Like you could go in and find something that says something totally different.
Right.
Um,
Which happens
so
all the
it's
time. All the time.
yeah. There was well, I mean, there's quite a few examples you can
There's
look to.
the biohacking nonsense that happened a couple of years ago, where like they were sending out these kits where you're like, oh, you can hack yourself and like inject your body with chemicals with this home lab thing, and it was all like basically a sham. There was nothing else to it. It was you had to have advanced knowledge and like to be able to use the thing, and if you had that advanced knowledge, likely you had access to a real lab. So
Yeah. So I mean, I think just very carefully interrogating sources, reporting, being critical. That applies to everybody. It applies to me. I mean, the people that are like, "You work for China," drive me nuts, and I usually just block them or mute them or
But
whatever
you do
because
work
it's just
for
not
China.
worth. It's
You
not worth
do.
engaging. It's
It's
true.
true.
It's true. I do. So
I know you do,
Yeah.
Ian.
That's yeah. So that should be kept in mind, right? You should keep in mind the biases of whoever's reading or whoever's writing, whoever's publishing. Like, this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum,
right.
right? So, if somebody's writing for X, Y, or Z publication or working for X, Y, or Z think tank, find out who's on their board, right? The boards of these places are usually staffed with like the most odious ghouls.
Sure.
In the U.S. military and NatSec industries and defense contractors and what have you, like just the most, I think Elliot Abrams sat on some boards for some of these places. So I
Yikes.
mean, if that tells you anything, right? So, and I mean, the think tank people
What's
really showed
Elliot
their ass on that one
Abrams'
because they
social
yeah.
credit score.
Yeah, I mean, the think tank people really showed their ass with that one because they came out in support of this butcher, this monster, and kind of showed their true colors there. So the people at like the Foundation for Democratic Democracy, or like the the Horatio Q Racism Institute for Applied Slavic Race Science. Or like the anti-Soviet Commission of 1987 or whatever, like these places that if you go even beyond the surface level, you'll find out they have an ideological mission. Then you can have a broader picture, right? A clearer eye on what's happening. I mean, and that takes time, and it sucks that we have to go through this. We should be able to just trust what we read, but you can't.
Right.
It's just an unfortunate fact, and so. I think that applies to me as well. Reach out to me if you have a question about something I'm saying or publishing or writing. And, if you're, I think people do this in bad faith and I think people do this in good faith. It's usually pretty easy to tell.
Yes.
But I like to consider myself open to this kind of questioning and criticism. So I'm no exception. So I use me as an example, not because I'm trying to validate my own work, but just because, I'm telling you to do this. Like, I mean it. Like
Yeah.
I want people to think critically about stuff.
Right. I mean, everyone is ideological, whether or not they consider themselves to be in their expressions, and particularly, I think, in journalism. So I guess, Ian, any sort of final thoughts, things you want to say before we land this proverbial plane?
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, well, the thing is, in terms of recommending resources as far as media goes, it's a grab bag almost, because there's not one uniformly good resource. There's good reporting happening in all kinds of places, but
Not Jacobin.
Fact.
What about commune?
They have plenty of problems themselves. Jacobin does.
Yeah.
They're not even the Jacobin they used to be.
Sad.
Yeah, it's tricky, but I would say just try to develop a really good nose for bullshit, right? Like, if you, I think the best strategy might be you take an obviously nonsense story, right? Like something that comes out of RFA or about the DPRK or something, where it really is just a total bald-faced lie. And you look for patterns in the way things are reported and the way things are sourced and the way quotes are used. It's again, it's like putting on the they live glasses or seeing the code of the Matrix, whatever dystopian sci-fi analogy you want to use, and you can start seeing these things, these patterns show up because fundamentally journalists are lazy, right? Like if there's an easy story, they'll take the easy story, and I know I there have been moments that I've done that too, but luckily it was lower stakes reporting. Just take a critical lens. Think about the broader forces at work in terms of reporting for a place like Washington Post that's owned by Jeff Bezos. If it's intuitively obvious that a place like the Washington Post can't do honest critical reporting about Amazon for the reasons of its ownership, then that should apply to the broader ideological and political missions of the institutions that support other publications or other outlets, right? Nobody is clean of influence, right? In my own experience as a local journalist in Texas, one of my first jobs was a hometown paper in Texas, my home county, and a big part of the home county is this planned community by Dow Chemical. Like the biggest city in this county started out as a planned community for Dow Chemical employees. And I love everybody I worked with at that paper. They gave me my start. I'm eternally grateful to them, and I don't think this is them. But obviously, if you write something about Dow Chemical, there's certain things you're not going to say, right? That's just obvious. And nobody ever sat us down and told us you can't write this way. And luckily, I didn't have to write too much because I did features. I didn't do hard news most of the time. But there's understandings. There's certain things that you just don't publish a report because it would ruin your access or your resources as a reporter. Right. And so at the local level that still exists. And then it exists all the way up top, right? Then it becomes the broader national commitments that the U.S. has that are then reflected in the media. So I love everybody I've worked with at that local paper and the local papers I had elsewhere, but they're captured to the same forces that inform everybody else in all other institutions. So I don't blame them, and I think they did great work, and they still do great work. So support your local newspaper is a very cliche thing to say, but do.
Unless they're owned by
doing the best.
Phil Anschutz, like the Gazette in Colorado Springs is.
Oh, okay. I'll amend that. I'll amend that to say, do your research on your local paper and then maybe support it if they're not garbage. Um, yeah, I mean, this is basic, materialist critique 101, right? Think about the big forces at work and think about how they might influence whatever's being written. And, again, same with me, right? The broader forces at work for me are, I mean, to some degree my employment, but also my political perspective, right? The opinions that I have about China now are the same that I had before I came here. Like, I can say that with total certitude and honesty. Now, whether you believe that or not, I can't control that. That's up to you. But for me, that's true. But at the same time, I exist within a system just like everybody else, and so I understand that there can be influences exerted on me, whether I realize it or not. So it applies everywhere, but it's up to you to make the kind of judgment call as to whether it's too much of an influence to take them seriously, or if it's not enough, and you think and you trust their ability to exert their judgment. So it really is, it's a difficult process. It's not an easy way to read news. It's difficult. It takes work, and it takes practice and research and effort to get to a point where you're doing this. But once you do, things make a lot more sense. So that's what I would recommend. The other thing I would say is, if you can afford it, come here, like visit.
We're thinking about it.
I had a friend
crashing
come
on your
here, a
couch,
friend
Ian.
from college. Yeah, sure, absolutely. To get a visa for China, one of the things you have to present is a letter of invitation from whoever you're staying with or whoever you're meeting there. I can write that letter
Ooh.
anytime.
Oh
Thank you.
shit!
Amazing.
And
There's gonna be 6
so yeah,
people
come-
on your floor in like 6 months.
Okay, I will get an air mattress. That's fine. Yeah, it's like I mean, and the airfare can be expensive, although not always.
It is, yeah.
You'd be surprised. You'd be surprised, especially if you fly a Chinese airline
Yeah.
because they're subsidized. But once you get here, things are not super expensive. And essential goods are not expensive. And if you don't go to the luxury sectors and get imported products and go to fancy hotels to eat at restaurants, then it's incredibly affordable. For just tourism or for just living. Like I make significantly less here than I did in Iowa at my previous job. But because the cost of living is low, and because part of my compensation is I get housing here, it's crazy. I'm actually able to save money where I wasn't able to before. Right. Like where I was paying car payments and maintenance and gas and insurance on transportation, I pay 100 yuan every like 2 months or so, and that's $15 for my transit
Yeah.
card. So I mean the my specific situation is beneficial in terms of cost of living. I don't make a crazy huge amount of money. I make about 30 grand a year, but I'm able to save. I'm able to pay off credit cards and student loans for once because cost of living is low,
Wow.
and because things are subsidized here. Things are cheap here. The stuff I need is cheap. Transportation is cheap. Tourism is cheap. Like the public, like the best tourism spot in China to me is the National Museum, and it's 100% free, and it's huge. It's bigger than the Smithsonian, maybe. I've been there 3 full days, and I still haven't seen everything. I've had to do the thing where it's getting close to the close of the museum, and I'm still in this huge exhibit, and I have to speed walk through the rest of the exhibit to get out. So there's tons of stuff to do at very little cost. So I mean, you come here and you experience it for yourself. You're going to see this stuff,
Right.
It can't be hidden from you any longer because you're here.
How
so I would
closely will
recommend
our
if
handler
you can.
follow us when we visit China? Will they? Is it like a 30-foot
I don't know,
rule
like,
or
It's a 2-car length.
2 car lengths?
Yeah.
Okay.
Walking or driving,
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah.
matter.
I gotta look over my shoulder to make sure my minder is okay with me saying all this. He says it's okay.
Okay. Cool.
Cool. Yeah. So I mean it's great. It's a good place to come. I had a friend from college come here a couple weeks ago, and he was astonished at what he was seeing and how different it was from what he was expecting. I had one of my colleagues had a bunch of friends from Ireland come in yesterday, and they were amazed how clean it was. Right? They couldn't believe how clean it was. They couldn't believe that the air wasn't black and sooty.
Speaking of Ireland, they planted a forest the size of Ireland in China, or they're planning on it anyway.
Yeah. I mean that's the thing. If you want to talk about policies that China does, I mean that's each policy could be an episode in
Yes,
itself,
yeah,
right? Because
absolutely.
it's these huge detailed plans that are all aiming to better the lives of regular people. China's laid down more high-speed rail track than the rest of the world combined twice
For the
over.
maximum profit of
Um,
the capitalist ruling class in China,
Yes,
of
of
Yes.
course.
course. Yeah, the billionaires. That's what
Yeah,
matters.
yeah. Huge public infrastructure and public transit projects are just a way of reinforcing the capitalist class's control. And obviously, high-speed rail doesn't make a country socialist, but again, this is another question for another time.
Right.
But
Sure.
yeah, I mean, if when you get on one of these trains, right, and you spend like $50 on a trip that would, Amtrak from Boston to New York is like at least 100, and it's less than half the distance and more than 3 times the length of time it takes to get from one place to
Yeah.
another. You can take a train from Beijing to Shanghai and get there in 4 or 5 hours.
Train tickets
and
from
that's
here to
800.
Chicago are almost as much as plane tickets, and it's
Yeah.
slow as shit.
I've ridden all of one public transportation in the last 6 years combined. So
Yeah. I mean, it's part of me has to check myself and be like, because I grew up in exurban Texas, like suburban exurban Texas, and so obviously there's no public transit there. You got your car and
Right,
drove
right.
everywhere.
Yep, the same way here.
So part of me, and I've been to cities with public transit. I've been to New York and everything. But I have to check myself and make sure that if I'm going like, wow, this is incredible, I have to say, is this China or is this just a major city? But I mean, Beijing is a fantastic subway system. For example, like they have great. Like I went to Washington D.C. for a weekend in January.
The metro blows.
Good timing. Everything was shut. Yeah, good timing. Everything was shut down. Well, the metro was. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't. Yeah, you have to do a lot of walking. But like I flew into Baltimore, and there's a MARC Amtrak train from Baltimore to Union Station in D.C. And I was getting out of the plane and going to the station, and I got my ticket, and I got my luggage upstairs. The elevator was out. Cool infrastructure support for a guy with a giant
Right.
bag, let alone somebody with a disability who needs to get somewhere. And so I was crossing the bridge above the train. The train was waiting at the station, and while I was crossing the bridge to get to the other side, the train left. And this was the 10:45 train that I missed by about half a minute to a minute. Right, I almost was there, and I had to wait until 11:55 for the next one.
Yikes.
Jesus.
And so I was like cursing myself, like this wouldn't happen in Beijing. and it's true, it wouldn't, because the Airport Express is linked to the subway system. It comes in every 3 minutes, and it's 25 yuan, so it's like $5. And yeah, and it's on my subway line too. I'm on line 10, so it's right there, so it's very convenient. And it's crowded. It's widely used. People like the public transit. It's something that regular people are using all the time. I mean, people in New York talk about the MTA as the great equalizer. Well, this is happening on a citywide scale and on a countrywide scale, because as more track gets laid down for high-speed rail, tickets get cheaper. And things get more efficient, like the costs go down, and so it's already very affordable, but it's going to get even more affordable in the future. So this is an example of what you'll experience if you come here. So
Except
I mean,
the difference is that if you landed in Baltimore, you could get into a cab and spend a couple of $100 getting from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and have it take a couple of hours because there is never not traffic on 495. So I don't know what
Yeah.
you're complaining about. There are options that you wouldn't have in a communist country that you do have in the free market system of the United States.
yeah. In Houston, where I'm from, shout out to Houston.
Murder capital alternating with DC, and smog capital alternating with Los Angeles every few years. Houston is winning.
Well, I still love Houston. Shout out to the cities in Texas. Houston, San Antonio, El Paso, Dallas, and Austin are also in
Yes.
Texas.
El Paso is right.
A limited shout out to Dallas and Austin. But yeah, I mean, you have great choice in Texas as far as transportation. You can take an Uber or a Lyft.
Damn.
Yeah, it's great. Or drive your own
market
car.
is
pay
so
the
efficient.
Insurance and payments.
It
How
on
the
that.
free
So-
market gives you options.
Yeah.
Yeah. Many kinds of internal combustion engines which emit CO2
And also
and ruin the
plenty
planet.
of opportunities for stalking.
Sure.
From your
Yep.
driver who has access to your email address and
Yep.
sometimes your home address if they take you home.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, these are the things that when you come to a place like this, and I mean, you go. I think this is true of people that go to Cuba or people that go to DPRK. I can't right now because my government has decided it's too dangerous for Americans to go to the DPRK.
Sad.
But this is the stuff people encounter, right? The veil gets lifted for a little while at least, and they get to see these societies for what they really are. And so I do recommend travel. But it's it's not everybody can't do that.
Right.
So that's why I publish some of my travels and my experiences too, because photos, it's interesting for one reason or another, and so if people can't go, I want to show them a little bit of what I'm seeing. But yeah, I mean, above all else, just be critical, just always be thinking about this stuff. I know it can be depressing and frustrating to be thinking about how all this stuff interconnects and enforces kind of ideological compliance, but we have to do it. It's how we break through. It's how we get people on our side. It's how we recruit, and it's how we start building this kind of movement, this kind of change that we need. So nobody ever said this stuff was easy, right? People don't take on left wing or socialist or communist politics because it's easy, right? It's going to be difficult, but we have to do it.
So speaking of building parties and growing organizations, really quickly before we go, we did want to announce that we're kind of in the early stages of developing what we're calling the Revolutionary Democracy Party, which it's going to be explicitly Marxist-Leninist. It's going to be international, and we're going to focus on education, particularly in the direction, especially in the West, of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and then also community building, which I think is lacking a lot in specifically Marxist-Leninist organizations that tends to be left to like anarchist and left comm groups. So we want to make sure that people within our community, working class folks, know that we care about them as people. So if you are interested in getting a little bit more information, you can go to www.revdemparty.com. It's kind of a shell at the moment, but it does have some very basic information. We're still fleshing a lot of things out. So we're planning on launching sort of the end of summer, perhaps early fall. Kind of depends on how long it takes us to put things together. But again, check out the website if you are interested in following our progress. Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much to Ian Goodrum.
Yeah. Hey, guys, remember, first CPC National Congress, 13 people.
We already have like 70 people who are like, we want to start branches.
Oh, okay. So you're already
so
ahead of
we're ahead of the CPC at this point.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to Ian Goodrum for coming on tonight to talk about the history of media in China and regarding China. And thank you so much to everyone for listening. Some suggested reading will be in the show notes. Our sponsors are all of our excellent fans on Patreon. We have too many to read each time now, but these are the new ones since our last recording. We have A Beat Up Blue Chevy, Aaron, Afro Kami, Alex, Andre, Andrew, Anon Account, Astrid, Avery, Basma, Basera, Black Metal Lennon. Shout out to Black Metal Lennon, in real life friend, not just on the internet. Blue Anessa, who I've been like harassing to join our Patreon for months. So thanks for that.
Extracting that capital.
Exactly. We're actually capitalists deep down inside. We have Brandon, other Brandon, Bryn, but not the Beat Beep Lettuce Bryn. Call me cis male. Jesus. Canadian ML, Chris, Cole, Commandante Ice Wallowcome, what the hell? Commosaurus Maximus, Comrade Cat, Connor, D, Daniel, Dante, Derek, Devin, Ethan, but not ours, I assume. Ian, which I'm going to guess is Ian Goodrum, and if it's not, I'm a little bit disappointed. Fayez, Gabriella, George, Gorar, Hal J. Smokes, Jack, other Jack, Jade, James, other James, Jeff, Jegdeg, John, other John, John 3, Jonathan, Jordan, Javon, Keenan, Costas, Kyle, Miles, Nicholas, Pearson, Peter, Provoke the Bouge, Quinn, Reverend Lawn Gnome Hollywood, Christ, Robert, Ryan, Ryan, Sasha Socialist, Sia, Shea, Shell, Steven, Sven, Tommy the Commie, Topic Thunder, TVVVV, Wat is to be done, and Wayne. All of these people are heroes of the revolution and make it so much easier for us to make this podcast for you. Please don't forget to rate and review. Visit prolespod.com, like us on facebook.com/prolespod, and follow us on Twitter at prolespod if you haven't detected a theme at this point. If you have any feedback, topic ideas, or suggestions, feel free to send us an email at prolespod@gmail.com or in the comment box on our website. Thank you so much for tuning in. Solidarity forever.
Abracadabra, the slasher to turn rapper. Only walk the red carpet to cover the blood splatter. I'm faster and deadly as data. They gather the master. Particle accelerators when searching for dark matter, y'all. I ain't come to grab the mic and rock the party. I came to cock the shotty and knock the chakras out your body. I'm like Rocky playing hockey. Peep my game face. I'll uppercut you out your Nikes if they ain't laced. Trust me, it ain't safe. I can't even aim straight. I pray the ricochet in your face. We'll meet in the same place. Y'all be smoking that crack with Lamar Odom, scratching his scrotum and hacking NASA with a dollar modem. All the bodies and skeletons I produce got them thinking there's a Jack the Ripper rapper on the loose. Boost records like steel from juice. You want a truce when I punch you in the nose like the Wally World Moose. Got to know. I've been waiting so long. Got to know. I've been waiting so long. Alakazam, I appeared through a cloud of smoke rising from the floor, levitating above them all. Beyond the Call of Duty owes a Commodore, rank much higher than the captain and the officer. There's nothing wrong with being true to your form, but a fraud is being something you're not. My uniform's decorated with stripes and stars, medals and gold bars, and ribbons draped weighing down my camouflage. The game's rigged from the start, in other words, call it sabotage. Falling, I assume the role of John Hobbs. Burn tarot cards till flames turn blue with an aliens from Avatar, Paradise, Shangri-La. Ha! Got to know. I've been waiting so long. Got to know. I've been waiting so long.
This is the Kremlin.